If you've been around Partick Trinity over the last few months, you'll know that we've been working together through Mark's Gospel. It started right back in August, chapter 1, verse 1. We're currently about halfway through, and the plan is to work our way right through to the end in time for Easter. And I'm glad to be joined here, sitting here with Sean, who you might recognise from often leading worship on a Sunday behind the piano, playing the guitar. But Sean's day job also involves reading the Bible, thinking about the Bible, and teaching in that whole area. And I thought it'd be great to be able to ask Sean some questions and hopefully give us something all to think about that will help us as we come to read the Bible for ourselves. But yeah, first of all, Sean, tell us, where do you work? What do you do? What does normal working life look like for you?
Yeah, so I work at the University of Glasgow. I'm professor of New Testament and Ancient Culture, and I've been there for 10 years. My regular working day is teaching from undergraduate first-year students, Introduction to the Bible, all the way to having doctoral students. And I do a lot of research myself. I'm really interested in understanding the ancient world, ancient education, ancient genre, ancient literature, and especially how Jews negotiated their space within the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, brilliant. And this evening we're just going to talk a bit about Mark itself in particular. And, on a Sunday, whatever passage we're looking at, I guess I have the mindset that there might be someone there who's not been for every other part of the series and is just looking at this one passage. But we're going to think about some questions about Mark as a whole to begin with. And I guess an obvious starting point is we call it Mark's Gospel, but at no time have we really stopped to say, well, who was Mark? Who is the person behind this text who's written it or put it together? Have you got any insight on that?
Yeah, so one of the questions that I know that you don't necessarily do in a sermon, but kind of underpins a lot of historical scholarship is about who wrote these texts, for whom, where, when, and why. So Mark's Gospel is called Mark's Gospel, but again, we actually don't know who Mark is. More importantly, actually, all of the Gospels, all four of them, are anonymous works, so they don't actually have the author claiming who they are. And this is a very common Jewish practice in the second and the ancient times, but it doesn't necessarily help us as readers to kind of know who is that person. So we're really dependent on church tradition, and church tradition is very clear that it is a person named Mark. Mark had a relationship with Peter, knew Peter, and kind of what his information that Mark has here is taken from Peter, one of the disciples.
Great. And so, we know from the whole way our calendar works, roughly when Jesus lived, 2,000 years ago. But when did a gospel like Mark, when do we think that emerged and where did it come from?
Yeah, so this is, again, there's lots of scholarly debate about all of these questions, but the dating of Mark is between, understandably, the last events of the narrative, which we think roughly happened about 33 AD, and we really think kind of the outside was probably written before 70. One of the questions we have when it comes to Mark's Gospel is, do we see any insight from the text about when it might have been used? We see Mark being likely used by Matthew and Luke as sources, so we kind of say it's written before them, but we don't really have a great sense. 70 CE is a really important date in Jewish history because that's when the Romans took over Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. And kind of a lot of secular scholars would look at, say, Mark 13, 1 and 2, and Jesus' declaration that the temple will be destroyed as kind of an insight about, okay, maybe it's around that time, 70. So most scholars would say before 70 or in and around 70, but some conservative scholars would actually go as early as maybe 40. Okay. So in that sense. So a full range, but really, most scholars would say definitely before 70.
Okay. And I guess a more basic question still, what is Mark's Gospel? I mean, what are we dealing with here?
Yeah. So Mark's Gospel in scholarship now is widely considered a biography. So even though we call it the Gospel, which is kind of the good news in Greek, the idea is that it has a lot of similarities to ancient biographical practices. So unlike modern biographies, ancient biographies are slightly different, but very much still focused on an individual. That individual, usually male, did important things in their life. Either was a general, a statesman, a philosopher, and they did things that are worthy of remembrance, and kind of regularly people would look at them to model their life after, often in a positive way, but also maybe sometimes in a don't do this kind of way. So Greek biography definitely has that emphasis on the individual. Some scholars would also say, actually, there's lots of characteristics of some of the Old Testament writings of history, which are very person-centered. And so I think if we look at them both as the biography as a whole, but also tied in with Jewish Israel history, I think we kind of get a real sense of what this book is about.
Okay, and if we go with that, why do you think we don't talk about Mark's biography of Jesus, or the biography of Jesus according to Mark? Why is there this fixation on that word gospel? Is that just because churches like using churchy words? I mean, where's that come from?
Yeah, so gospel became a technical term in early Christianity. So this is the proclamation of who Jesus is, very specifically his death, burial, and resurrection. And we see this in some of Paul's letters talking about his gospel, what he's preaching about Jesus. And so this idea about what is we talking about Jesus' life became very technical in that way. But part of it also is Mark's gospel begins with the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, right? So the first few words in Mark's text kind of identify it as a euangelion, a gospel in that sense. And so that's really where some of those, that kind of reinforces that title.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Even though it'd probably be more likely to be thought of as a biography, but this is a more scholarly approach recently, so that helps us kind of understand it in this ancient perspective.
Yeah, and do you have a sense of, I mean, for us, obviously, if we're reading the Gospel of Mark, for us that is like a window into the life of Jesus, what he taught, how people responded to him, all of that. But clearly, if we're going right back to this first generation of Christians, what do you think they had in mind? Do we have any clues as to why they would write all this down as opposed to, I don't know, passing on by word of mouth? Do we have a sense of what it was for in that sense, in a real practical sense? Presumably at one point someone put pen to paper or papyrus or whatever it was.
Yes, papyrus.
And then from there it spread. Was the intention that it would spread? Do you think the author would be surprised to know that different groups were reading the same thing? I mean, do you have any?
I do think the Gospel, Mark or whoever wrote it would be surprised at how it's survived today, like how important it has been within church history. I don't think they were necessarily recognizing its import. But it's clear that right after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, that the early Christian community talked about Jesus, shared stories, were kind of regularly meeting and talking to other people who weren't Christ followers and telling that narrative. And so there's this clear oral element to the ancient world that these texts and stories were part of. At some point, Mark was like, okay, we need to put these down. And the dominant view is that actually maybe some of the earliest Christ followers, the disciples, were starting to die, and so they wanted to really encapsulate and encode those narratives and stories for future generations. Just because these are written down, though, definitely didn't stop the oral tradition and the oral telling of stories. There's lots of evidence that even a few generations later, they're really interested in, oh, you heard this other story, you were a disciple of John or a disciple of John's disciple, and tell us stories about what he told about the fireside.
Yeah.
So these texts were also part of the larger group of what Christian teaching would be.
Okay, and that kind of, I guess, for me, as I read the New Testament, I see the people who encounter Jesus for themselves, and then Jesus calling people to himself and then sending them out. And in the book of Acts and in Paul's lecture, you see that kind of happening. People are turning up in places and sharing this good news gospel about Jesus, and people are responding in different ways. You don't read about in those stories people writing down texts like this, but clearly that was obviously happening around then and part of all that.
Yeah, and we have 4 Gospels, so it's not as if this Mark is unique in that sense. There are other Christian Christ followers who are very interested in telling their story of Jesus as well, and we have these here. We also have Paul's letters. The Christian community was, even though the ancient world was still very orally driven, there's not a lot of literacy in the ancient world, it was still very much a movement of texts. We're going to talk a little bit later about the idea of Old Testament scripture, what is Jewish scripture for them at the time, was really important. And they're still reading these texts, trying to understand it in light of what they've experienced with Jesus.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then, we've talked about the opening words of Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And then, just give us if you can, a kind of overview of, if you'd never read Mark before and you read it from the beginning to the end, what is it that we notice, and what, as a scholar, strikes you as you work with this text alongside other texts? What's distinctive about Mark?
Well, one of the key things about Mark's Gospel, like any biography, is trying to ask the question, who is Jesus? Trying to tell the reader, who is this person who is worthy of this kind of literary treatment? And we find it both declarations at the front, we'll kind of unpack that in a second, but also all the way through, people are asking, who is this person who can still the waves? Who is this person who can forgive sins? Who is this person? And so you have these characters regularly asking the question for the reader. And Mark, in his text, is very clear who this person is. So the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the good news of Son of God, a lot of scholars would see in that strong resonances with something called the Priene inscription. So this is an inscription written about Caesar Augustus. So very much in the first century, it would have been around. We found a few of them scattered around the empire. And this inscription talks about the good news of the birth of Caesar Augustus, Son of God, who brings peace to the Roman Empire. And so it's a lot of scholars would be like, oh, somebody reading from the ancient world, reading Mark's Gospel, that opening little bit, and would kind of see some resonances. Oh, it's Jesus who's the Son of God, not maybe a strong contrast with Rome and the idea of Caesar being the Son of God.
Yeah.
So you have that kind of right at the beginning. Also at the beginning, it's very clear. Right after that, we have scripture, just as it's said in the book of Isaiah, and we have a quotation. We also have then John the Baptist coming and saying, you are the Christ. The sky is opening up, God in this text saying, you are my son. And so you have all of these pieces at the very beginning, the narrator, scripture, John the Baptist, God in the text, all kind of saying, this is who Jesus is, at the very beginning. We, as the reader, are privileged in that kind of information, and we are watching other people struggle to understand that, whether that's the church leaders, the scribes, the disciples, everybody else. So we kind of laugh at them because they don't really get it, but we're told at the very beginning, and it's clear that the whole narrative kind of reinforces what we find kind of in Mark 1:1-8.
Yeah. And I've had it put to me before, it's almost like a whodunit, where you know who's committed the crime, and then you go back and watch from the beginning, and you can see how all the kind of clues lead you there.
Yeah.
So that's clearly the big thing, is presenting those people who don't know who Jesus is, and then in different ways making that clear. And
having lots of people regularly go through. All the demons in chapter 1, they know who Jesus is. We see characters eventually come to understanding. So Mark 8 is a kind of a central pivot within the text. in which Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they give, John the Baptist, prophet of old, Elijah. And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And then Jesus is like, "Yes, you're right." And then we have, in that moment, a radical redefinition of what kind of the Christ or Messiah, Greek, Christ is Messiah in Greek, means for the Jewish people. Most of the time, the Messiah had very political overtones, very militaristic, conquest, redeeming the people of Israel, but in a very, this is our land, we're going to be independent, autonomous again, as opposed to the way that he's trying to redevelop it, and then of rejection, death, and kind of vindication by God.
Yeah. And then, one of the interesting, that strong focus on who's Jesus, but actually quite a lot of space is given over to everyone else, I guess, around him. And then particularly, obviously, we get this named group of the 12, who, we have a series of different stories that show how they came to encounter Jesus and follow him at the beginning of the gospel. And then they're just kind of a bit of basically a fixture for the rest. Mm-hmm. What do you think is going on there? What's this focus, not just on Jesus, but on that slightly wider circle? What's that there for? Why has that made the cut?
Yeah. So within Mark's gospel, you find different groups, and they have different levels of closeness to Jesus. So John the Baptist is fairly close to the beginning, but he leaves. The disciples are kind of those inner circle, and even of those disciples, Peter, James, and John are the true inner circle. They go up on the mountain with him in Mark 9. They get called in the Garden of Gethsemane a little bit further. They are the people who really are close to Jesus. Around them, you have some of the women and other disciples. You have the crowds. And so you have different ways in which people are engaging with Jesus. And all of them are doing different things. Some are outright rejecting him, such as the Jewish leaders in the text. Some are kind of on the fence, the crowd. They're kind of with him sometimes and against him other times. They struggle with his teaching. And then you have kind of the disciples who are giving up things but still struggling to understand what discipleship really means for them. One of the themes throughout Mark's gospel is we have who is Jesus, but then a subsequent question is, what does it mean to follow Jesus? In the ancient world, the master or teacher, the head of a philosophical school, had disciples, and the best disciples became almost a mirror image of their teacher. That's what you're aiming for, to become little teachers and then make your disciples like your teacher, kind of the head. So part of this idea is, how do these people become like Jesus? And in the text, they fail. They don't actually make it.
Yeah, that's very striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
He doesn't spare the blushes of these close followers. They constantly seem to be wrong.
And this is where the book of Acts looks very different. You have Mark, in Mark, Peter, kind of this fumbling person, same with in the Gospel of Luke, and then suddenly in Acts, he is the leading spokesperson, confident, bold, going to prison, unapologetic. And part of that, is how do we get that pivot, whether that's the Holy Spirit or something else. But the idea is that in Mark's gospel, one of the characterizations of the disciples is failure in this. Mm-hmm. They don't actually get it. And part of the debate among scholars is, why doesn't Mark provide us with the ideal disciple for us to kind of model after? Yeah. And part of it is saying, first of all, it's really hard. It's super costly. Jesus is saying here, you have to give up family, land, all of these things. Give up your life. This is a hard teaching. And most people think actually there's some people in Mark's community that are really struggling with this. So not really fully living out the Christ-following lifestyle as a Christian. And so therefore, actually, the depictions in Mark's gospel seem much more realistic of failure, but keep trying, as opposed to the ideal, perfect one who actually we're probably not going to actually live up to anyway.
Yeah, yeah. That's really helpful. I wonder if we could talk a wee bit more about the structure of Mark's Gospel. I mean, for me, if I think back to going to Sunday school, you'd have all these stories about Jesus, calming a storm, healing someone, the cross, and they would all feel like these kind of isolated incidents.
Yeah.
And in a way, as you grow older, if you're reading through the Bible, because we have the 4 Gospels that all tell the story of Jesus like slightly differently, different things included, different things left out, some of the same events but in a slightly different arrangement. I guess you could get the impression that Mark is just, it's like a playlist of songs, someone's hit shuffle, and apart from the cross being at the end.
Yeah.
And yet, I'll push you on this a wee bit. I mean, it seems to me as I read Mark, it's not just a random shuffling of events, but there's a clear movement through 2 or maybe 3 different acts of really what's happening. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so traditionally, kind of basically for the 1960s or so, especially with German scholarship, they had a very low view of the literary quality of Mark's Gospel, and in fact, all the Gospels as a whole.
So, tease that out for us. What do you mean by that? Is
it
badly written? Or?
Oh yeah, so basically the view was that Mark's Gospel, if you kind of think of it, there's lots of little short stories, like either that's a healing or an exorcism or a parable or a confrontation, and all of these little forms, actually if you move them around, you could, and the idea would be that, and the image they use is beads on a string. So Mark is basically just has a string and is like, oh, I found another story, and he's like a little kid putting beads on a string, knows no idea of the composition of the whole, not looking for patterns or these kind of things. That is very much not the case now in scholarship. There has been a real literary movement on reading Mark as literature and trying to understand the literary quality of it on its own terms. And I do think actually there is a structure. So the idea is that you start, obviously, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, unlike our modern biographies where we want a birth narrative or like something like that. We want or like what was the key event in this childhood that kind of created the psyche of that that would show up as in their adult life. The ancients were just really interested in the ministry, the career of that person. So you start, I think John the Baptist is essential at the beginning. Like we see that in all the Gospels. I think that's a real anchor. The calling of the disciples also really needing to be at the beginning. Some of his, what he does in his ministry, especially before chapter 8, even if you kind of move them around, they're actually really clumped nicely in the sense of there's conflict, there is teaching, there is exorcism, there is different movements within that. We see a clear kind of pivot in the middle of the text with the declaration of Jesus being the Christ by Peter, and then the Mount of Transfiguration right afterwards, God again declaring, "This is my son." No qualms now about this. And then we see that a very clear movement towards Jerusalem and what would be the crucifixion time. Yeah. So it really is that kind of end climax. It ends kind of on a quasi cliffhanger a bit, but it does have this real movement. And if you read it as a one or like in kind of larger chunks, you really get that sense of movement. One of the challenges, obviously, in churches, you kind of take a little snippet out, but that's not how it's supposed to be read. Yeah. Like you're losing the context regularly and kind of the movement and flow. So, in Mark's Gospel, the size of it would be, you could read it or listen to it. There's some great podcasts out there about somebody reading it in one go, about an hour and a half. It's good after dinner entertainment in a land with no Netflix. Yeah. So that's that's kind of a way that you really get a feel for the repetition and the intentional repetition.
Yeah, and I guess what we're used to the biography, I guess it begins in childhood, and say it was a prime minister or something. okay, it might slow down, and there might be a focus of the years that they were particularly in prominence in the public eye, and then kind of what happened next. With Mark's Gospel, we've got this huge percentage of the whole is given over just those last few days and hours as he enters into Jerusalem, and then even before that, we have these predictions that are sort of gearing you up to think, oh, this is the big thing that's going to happen, and then it's treated like the big thing that's happening, isn't it? It's given over that space. Now, I know a lot of ink has been spilt on the end of Mark. Do you want to say a bit about that? Because it's quite striking. Yeah,
so for those of you who haven't read the end of Mark, you should. But part of it is at the end of Mark 16, the women go to the tomb, they find it open, they find Jesus not there, and a declaration by the angel to kind of go and tell the disciples. But the women run away afraid and they don't tell anybody. End of story. Okay. And, it's really kind of leaving it, what happened? A lot of our expectations as readers, and especially the modern Christian world, is that because we know of Matthew and Luke and John, we're expecting some appearances of Jesus, some other bits, but it is very abrupt, that ending. And so some people have called this open ending intentional. Some people have suggested we maybe have lost something. I don't think we've lost something. I think it's an intentional ending by Mark. But it's clear in the ancient world, they also didn't really like this ending. There's some additional endings that you can find usually in brackets at the end of Mark's Gospel, the so-called shorter ending and the so-called longer ending, both of which are additions to the ending.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And so part of it is saying what's happening. Yeah. And if we want to kind of take the kind of the literary approach, the open-endedness is like, it's clear, well, the women did go and tell somebody, right? We have the story. So it's not as if, so part of it is like that, still open about what's happening.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I don't have one of the church Bibles in front, but a lot of English language translations, they have almost like a little asterisk footnote, and they give you these other endings that obviously at different points have been attached to Mark to kind of give that more rounded ending, or an ending that seems more like what we find in Matthew or Luke or one of the other Gospels. Yeah,
and they're pretty early, so they're kind of 2nd, 3rd century, so it's not as if they're super late. But there's definite sometimes a really clear evidence that they're bringing in some bits from other Gospels to kind of make that ending more satisfying.
Yeah, I like the short ending. I like the fact that they get sent back to Galilee, to these disciples, and it's Galilee where we begin with all these questions. who is Jesus? And it kind of pushes you to think.
So the no ending, or like the shorter additional ending.
No, I like the no ending.
The no ending, yeah. The ending, the proper ending. Yeah.
The no ending. Yeah. Okay, well that's been really, really helpful. Yes, I touched just there. I said our English language Bibles, and occasionally make reference to the fact that the New Testament, the whole New Testament, including Mark's Gospel, was originally written in Greek. And you could, if you want, go to Waterston's or Big Shop and buy the New Testament in Greek and see the original text, and then you'd see a whole range of different English language Bibles where individuals or teams of people have put it into English, and sometimes we notice there's quite striking differences between them. Do you want to give us any insight on what's it mean to be reading something in English that was originally in a different language?
Yeah, so Mark is written in Greek, and the Greek is, it's okay. It's not high Greek, it's not bad Greek, it's just kind of normal Greek for the ancient world at this time, so-called Koine Greek. And naturally, I think, it's worth reading any work in its original language. That's how it's written. There's lots of interesting features that you can see that are there. Anytime you read a text in translation, there are considerations and choices that the translators have to make. Almost all of the texts we're using right now in Bible, whether that's the New Revised Standard Version, the NIV, any of the other major Bible translations, they're done by committee. Okay. So it's a group of people. So I do some work with the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, kind of understanding some of the Greek text and the translation. And basically you translate the text, you sit in a group with 15, 20 people, you hammer out, what is this word? How do we want to use it? What's the best English word for that? How do we kind of, what is it? What are we implying with this English? What does this Greek word mean? What are all the possibilities? And there's decisions made all the way. There's no one-to-one for a Greek word and an English word, and so there are choices. And English language changes over time, so naturally translations need to change over time because the meaning of certain words also vary. Being not from the UK, I've also found that certain English words have different meanings and different connotations. Yeah. So is this translation done mostly by American and North American scholars or British scholars or otherwise? So there's lots of different considerations about which text to use. I actually don't really have too much problem with a lot of the English translations, as long as you know what you're using them for. There's some translations that are, I think, really, really readable. So The Message is kind of like a great example by Eugene Peterson. And I think it's a really, really fun, engaging translation. Yeah. He translated it for his specific community in the States he was trying to get across the vibrancy of the text, but to a group of people who are really undereducated or kind of from deprived areas. And so he did a great job of kind of taking the English and moving it into a more readable English. That is a great way to kind of get a new flavor of the text. Whether or not we want to always build our theological constructs on that's I think, a second question. But part of it is saying, if you want to read these texts and kind of have a variety, if you read them in two different ones, you kind of get a sense of, where is there variance in this text and what kind of space that the authors needed or the translators needed to kind of negotiate.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, really helpful, and I guess that sense of when we were saying is the language Mark was using was not kind of highfalutin. I need to be a professor to understand what this is saying. It could have been read to a kind of mixed group, and most of them would have had a kind of handle on what was saying.
Well, absolutely, there's very little there that the average person wouldn't get. I think the only challenge would be if you're, say, non-Jewish and you're obviously there's lots of scripture, you might not actually know all of the kind of the behind. What does this mean for the Jewish people? And
Mark gives us a couple of wee points where he kind of explains what something means, and clearly is obviously assuming that someone reading it wouldn't have all that background either, which is interesting.
There's we've got
another 2,000 years of distance to get us caught up on. Okay, well, right. This has been really interesting, really helpful. If I'm sitting reading Mark or one of the other Gospels myself at home, and I don't have a library full of books, I don't have a professor sitting next to me, are there any things that are like good habits that are going to make it easier to get a real sense what the Bible's saying, or anything that we should try or bad habits that you see that you just slip into, or maybe things that you have ways of reading the Bible you thought, I used to do that when I was younger, but actually it's more helpful to do it like this. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that I have really grown to appreciate, and I spend a lot of my time doing this, so it's maybe not as feasible for lots of, but reading the text and reading a commentary with the text. There's some wonderful commentaries that are out there, and some that are obviously very technical, that are designed more for scholars, but there's a lot that are really designed for ministers or lay people who are just interested in the text. You don't need any knowledge of Greek or anything else. And they'll give you a sense of, this is the kind of the background, this will help you understand what's happening here. One of the things I know I still do, it's default reading, is that I read the text and I don't even know where I'm kind of bringing in my own modern baggage to that. And so reading a commentary can help kind of bring that mirror to do that. There's some really good study Bibles out there that will kind of maybe, if they're not quite as dense as a commentary, that will kind of give you those. I don't necessarily recommend the internet as like going to search for all those, but there are reasonable sites and stuff like that. But reading also in community, I think helps. I think we talked about the small groups and those kind of things. Some of the times you don't really see your blind spot until you think, oh, this I know what this means, and you kind of say it, and then somebody in your small group says, that's not how I see it. Yeah. And then you kind of get confronted by the assumptions that you have of the text. And so I think reading in community actually is one of the best ways to kind of learn from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I can see, this coming Sunday, we've got the passage where Jesus tells his disciples off for telling the children basically to leave him alone. And that's one of these things where I realise that, 21st century, children, the rights of children, where this government saying our number one priority is the welfare of children, and saying that's probably not what that culture generation would think. They would associate children with, not quite having arrived yet as people in the sense of having influence or
well, not only that, high infant mortality. They're really often a drain of resources. It can be really burdensome, especially without birth control. You don't necessarily have control of a family in a way that you would today.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, John, thanks very much. And makes me want to read Mark again.
Well, I do recommend reading Mark again. But obviously, I'm happy to. If people have questions, I'm really happy to talk about more about this. So.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.